Welcome back to Shadow Warefare. This is not a channel for entertainment. This is not a channel for people who want soft messages. This is a channel for those who are tired of fighting battles they don't understand. For those who have prayed, fasted, cried, and still felt resistance. For those who know deep in their spirit that something invisible has been working against their progress, their health, their family, and their destiny. On this channel, we expose the strategies of the dark realm not to glorify it, but to destroy its power through truth, spiritual understanding, and divine authority. And today's message is not accidental. If you click this video, it means something in the spirit world wanted you distracted, delayed, or silent. But you're here, and that already tells me something about you. Today's topic is one many witches, occult practitioners, and spiritual attackers do not want discussed openly. Because once you understand this, their advantage collapses. Which reveals the 6 fasting laws that terrify witches the most. Let me say that again slowly, because this is not about hunger. This is about authority. Fasting is not a Christian diet plan. It is not spiritual weight loss. It is not punishment for sin. Fasting is a legal weapon in the spirit realm. And witches know this. I'm not speaking from theory. I'm speaking from what happens behind closed doors, from what is discussed in covens, from what is whispered during rituals, from what causes panic when certain believers stop eating and start aligning. You see, witches don't fear prayer alone. They fear aligned fasting, because fasting changes jurisdiction. Many of you watching have fasted before and saw little result, and you assumed fasting doesn't work. No. It worked, just not legally. There are laws that govern fasting, and when those laws are violated, fasting becomes noise instead of power. But when those laws are honored, the spirit realm responds violently. Let me pull you into something deeper. In witchcraft, fasting is understood differently than most believers realize. In the occult world, fasting is recognized as a way to thin the veil between realms, sharpen spiritual perception, and transfer authority from the flesh to the spirit. That's why witches fast before rituals. That's why they abstain before summoning. That's why they cleanse their bodies before spiritual assignments. So when a believer fasts correctly, it doesn't just draw them closer to God. It interrupts dark operations already in motion. This is why certain attacks suddenly stop during your fast. This is why dreams intensify. This is why witches monitoring you report confusion. This is why some curses fail mid-assignment. And this is why witches fear fasting believers more than loud believers. The first law you must understand is this: fasting is a legal declaration, not an emotional sacrifice. In the spirit realm, nothing moves because you are tired, emotional, or desperate. It moves because you have authority. When you fast correctly, you are declaring, I temporarily suspend the rule of my flesh so my spirit can operate without interference. Shifts hierarchy. Witches understand hierarchy deeply. They know spirits obey rank, not volume. And fasting elevates rank. When a believer fasts without understanding this, they starve their body but leave their authority untouched. But when they fast with awareness, intention, and alignment, spirits recognize the shift immediately. This is why witches monitor fasting believers. They don't mock it, they fear it, because fasting announces that something is about to be overturned. Now listen carefully, because this part exposes a major mistake many people make. Fasting does not force God to act. Fasting forces you to align, and alignment is what terrifies witches. When alignment happens, access is revealed. Many of you have been attacked not because you are weak, but because you are misaligned. The enemy doesn't need to overpower you, only to keep you slightly off position. Fasting corrects position, and once position is corrected, resistance becomes illegal. Let me explain it another way. In the occult, witches operate on spiritual permissions. They look for open doors, misalignments, emotional instability, unrepented bitterness, and broken spiritual discipline. When fasting is done without correcting these things, witches still retain access. But when fasting is paired with alignment, repentance, forgiveness, humility, obedience, the doors slam shut. This is when panic sets in. This is when rituals fail. This is when monitoring spirits lose signal. This is when assignments expire early. And many believers never experience this because they were never taught the laws. The second fasting law witches fear is when fasting is done in silence, not performance. Witches rely on visibility. They monitor activity. They watch patterns. They observe declaration. Public fasting without spiritual cover is easy to counter. But silent fasting, fasting that is hidden, disciplined, and sealed, is difficult to track. This is why certain breakthroughs happen when no one knew you were fasting. Silence disrupts surveillance. In witchcraft, observation strengthens influence, but fasting in silence removes the observer's advantage. And when witches cannot observe, they cannot adjust. This is why some of you suddenly receive breakthroughs without opposition, because the enemy didn't see it coming. And this brings me to something very important. If your fasting always ends with exhaustion and discouragement instead of clarity and authority, something is missing, because fasting done correctly produces lightness, not heaviness. It sharpens discernment. It strengthens resolve. It restores command. Witches know this. That's why they dread believers who fast correctly, because those believers stop reacting and start ruling. And we're only getting started, because the remaining fasting laws don't just block witchcraft. They reverse it, expose it, and return it void. And this is where things begin to get uncomfortable for the dark side, because what I'm about to reveal is rarely spoken about openly. Yet it explains why certain spiritual attacks suddenly collapse without warning. There is a specific point during fasting where the spirit realm recalibrates its assessment of you. Witches know this point very well. It usually happens after the flesh stops screaming and the spirit begins to lead. That's why the third fasting law terrifies witches more than the first two combined. The third law is this: fasting reaches maximum power when the fast outlasts the flesh's resistance. In the occult world, there is a saying that the body is the loudest traitor. The flesh negotiates with spirits through appetite, comfort, and habit. When fasting begins, witches are not afraid on day 1. They are not alarmed on day 2. They often wait, because they know many people quit when hunger becomes intense, when headaches come, when irritation rises, when sleep. But when the fast continues beyond that resistance point, the flesh stops negotiating. And when the flesh goes silent, the spirit takes command. This is the moment witches fear, because once the spirit is fully in command, the believer's authority becomes clean, sharp, and uncompromised. This is when prayer stops sounding emotional and starts sounding judicial. This is when declarations stop being requests and start being verdicts. In witchcraft, spirits are trained to exploit the flesh. They attach to cravings, they amplify discomfort, they whisper excuses. So when a believer pushes through, witches report something very specific. They say, the signal changed. That's how they describe it. The spiritual frequency shift. Attacks that once landed easily now meet resistance. Dream manipulation becomes harder. Emotional agitation loses its grip, and this is why some of you experienced unusual peace during longer fasts, not because problems vanished, but because the spirit rose above interference. Witches fear believers who know how to outlast the flesh, because once the flesh is dethroned, control becomes impossible. Now let me expose something even deeper. The fourth fasting law that terrifies witches is fasting paired with forgiveness. This one causes real panic. Unforgiveness is one of the strongest anchors witches rely on. It creates spiritual gravity. It keeps prayers heavy. It slows authority. In witchcraft, resentment is considered a spiritual handle. As long as bitterness exists, influence remains possible. But fasting while releasing forgiveness removes the handle, and when the handle is gone, manipulation fails. Many believers fast intensely but hold grudges silently. They starve the body while feeding resentment. Witches are not threatened by it. But when fasting is paired with intentional forgiveness, even forgiveness that feels unfair, the spiritual environment shifts violently. This is when curses lose traction. This is when witchcraft rebounds without being sent back. Because unforgiveness is often the legal ground the enemy uses to stay attached. When forgiveness happens during fasting, it's not just emotional release, it's legal eviction. And witches know this. They warn each other about fasting believers who forgive. Because those believers don't just resist attacks, they become untouchable. Now let me slow down here, because this part matters. Forgiveness during fasting does not mean pretending wounds never happened. It means surrendering the right to revenge. And in the spirit realm, surrendering that right transfers judgment to God. That transfer is dangerous for the enemy, Because once judgment leaves your hands, it enters divine hands. And witches do not want God involved in disputes. They can handle emotional believers. They cannot handle divine intervention. This is why certain attacks suddenly boomerang after a season of fasting and forgiveness. Not because you fought back, but because heaven did. Now here comes the fifth fasting law, and this one exposes why some fasts feel powerful and others feel empty. The fifth law is this: fasting must be sealed with obedience. Witches understand obedience deeply. In their world, power flows through submission to hierarchy. When believers fast but continue in known disobedience, authority leaks. It's like pouring water into a cracked vessel. Many believers fast for breakthrough while refusing to obey instructions they already received, and witches are not threatened by that. But when fasting is paired with obedience, even small, uncomfortable obedience, spiritual authority consolidates. This is when angels move faster. This is when resistance weakens. This is when delays dissolve, because obedience aligns you with divine order, and divine order is something witches cannot override. They can manipulate chaos. They cannot penetrate order. This is why fasting believers who obey quickly are reported as dangerous. They don't argue with instruction. They don't negotiate with conviction. They move, and movement terrifies the enemy. Because delayed obedience keeps doors open, immediate obedience slams them shut. Now listen closely, because the sixth fasting law is the one witches fear the most. Not because it blocks attacks, but because it exposes them. The sixth law is this: fasting activates spiritual light. Darkness thrives in confusion, distraction, and ignorance. Fasting clears perception. This is why dreams intensify. This is why discernment sharpens. This is why hidden motives surface. And witches hate exposure more than resistance. They can fight resistance. They cannot survive exposure. When fasting activates spiritual light, hidden operations come into view. This is when you suddenly recognize patterns. This is when you discern false connections. This is when you sense spiritual interference clearly instead of vaguely. And once something is seen clearly, it loses power. Witches rely on secrecy, subtlety, and confusion. Fasting dismantles all three. This is why some witches stop targeting fasting believers and move on, because exposure ends advantage. Now let me speak directly to you watching this. If you felt drawn to fasting but hesitant, if you've started fasts and quit, if you've wondered why some fasts worked and others didn't, it's not because fasting failed, it's because laws were ignored. But now you know, and knowing changes everything. You don't need to announce your fast. You don't need to impress anyone. You don't need perfection. You need alignment. And when alignment happens, fear shifts, not in you, but in the enemy, because witches don't fear loud Christians. They fear aligned, fasting believers who know who they are. If this message spoke to your spirit, stay connected to Shadow Warefare, because what we expose here is not meant to scare you. It's meant to position you. And position decides battles, because entering a fast is only half the battle. What truly determines long-term victory is what happens after the fast ends. This is another reason witches fear knowledgeable fasting believers, not just because they fast, but because they don't lose the ground they gain. Let me take you behind the scenes again. In witchcraft, there is a waiting strategy. When a believer fasts, witches often pause direct attacks. They observe. They wait for the fast to end. Why? Because many believers return to old habits immediately after fasting, old thought patterns, old emotional reactions, old compromises. And when that happens, access quietly reopens. This is why the next truth is critical. Fasting is not a temporary power boost, it is a repositioning. If the repositioning is not maintained, authority leaks back into the flesh. This is why the seventh principle, though not called a law openly, is something witches hope believers never learn. The authority gained in fasting must be guarded by discipline afterward. Witches fear believers who fast and then stay alert. Because after fasting, spiritual sensitivity is high, discernment is sharp, perception is clear, but if distractions flood back in immediately, excessive noise, uncontrolled emotions, spiritual laziness, sensitivity dulls again, and witches know how to exploit dullness. That's why many attacks return weeks after a powerful fast. Not because the fast failed, but because vigilance ended. This is why fasting should be followed by quiet consistency, not spiritual relaxation. You don't need to stay hungry. You need to stay aligned. Now let me address something many people misunderstand. Fasting does not make you immune to attack. It makes attacks illegal, and illegal attacks still try, but they fail faster. This is why some of you notice strange resistance attempts after fasting. Not stronger attacks, weaker ones, confusing ones, because the enemy no longer has authority, only irritation, and irritation always exposes itself. Now let me speak plainly. If fasting did not scare witches, it would not be attacked so aggressively in modern culture. Notice how fasting is mocked, ignored, watered down, replaced with comfort theology. That's not accidental. Anything that threatens spiritual darkness gets reframed as extreme, unnecessary, or outdated. But fasting remains one of the few disciplines that directly strips power from spiritual opposition, because it realigns hierarchy. Now I want to help you understand something practical. A fast does not need to be extreme to be effective. It needs to be intentional. Witches fear clarity more than intensity. A simple fast done with understanding, forgiveness, obedience, silence, endurance, and alignment is far more dangerous than a dramatic fast done emotionally. This is why some people see breakthrough on partial fasts, while others see nothing on long ones. It's not about duration alone. It's about legality. Now listen carefully to this final truth, because it ties everything together. Witches do not fear fasting because it starves the body. They fear fasting because it feeds authority. Authority is the real threat. Authority cancels permissions. Authority closes doors. Authority removes access. And fasting is one of the fastest ways to restore it. If you've felt spiritually tired, blocked, or constantly resisted, it's not because you're weak. It's because something has been feeding while you haven't been aware. Fasting corrects that imbalance. And once balance is restored, fear changes sides. Let me leave you with this. You don't need to fear witches. They already fear aligned believers. They fear people who understand spiritual laws. They fear people who don't panic. They fear people who don't react emotionally. They fear people who fast with wisdom. And if you're watching this, something tells me you're becoming one of those people. Stay connected to Shadow Warefare, because here we don't hype battles, we expose them, and exposure always wins. Good. Let's go deeper, because now we're entering the layer that separates temporary breakthrough from permanent spiritual dominance. Most believers are taught how to start a fast. Very few are taught how to live as someone who has fasted, and witches are counting on that ignorance. Here is something rarely said plainly. After a correct fast, the spirit realm treats you differently. Not emotionally, not symbolically, legally. Your spiritual posture changes, and posture determines what can approach. This is why witches become cautious after a believer completes a fast properly. They don't rush back in. They test the perimeter. They send small irritations, minor temptations, emotional triggers, not to overpower you, but to see if you're still aligned. This is where many people fail. They assume the battle is over and let their guard down. But fasting does not end a war. It changes its rules. Before fasting, you may have been fighting to survive. After fasting, the enemy is fighting to regain access. That's a very different dynamic, and witches hate fighting uphill. Now let me reveal something extremely important. In the occult, fasting believers are categorized. Yes, categorized. Some are labeled allowed but unstable, some are labeled committed but unaware, and a very small number are labeled untouchable. The difference is not how often they fast. It's how they carry themselves afterward. Untouchable believers move slowly, speak carefully, forgive quickly, obey promptly, and discern deeply. They don't rush decisions. They don't chase emotional highs. They don't argue spiritually. And witches know, arguing believers are easy to drain. Calm believers are not. Fasting produces calm when done correctly. Not passivity, clarity. And clarity terrifies manipulation. Now let me address something you may have noticed but never understood. After fasting, some people experience sudden relationship shifts. People fall away. Conversations change. Certain environments feel uncomfortable. That's not coincidence. Fasting raises spiritual standards, and anything that doesn't match those standards begins to feel heavy. Witches understand this dynamic and exploit it when possible. They try to lure fasting believers back into low-frequency environments where alignment weakens. That's why wisdom after fasting is crucial. You don't have to isolate, but you must discern. Alignment must be protected. Now I want to speak directly to those who feel spiritually called, but constantly attacked. You are not attacked because you fast. You fast because you are attacked. And witches know calling attracts resistance. But fasting sharpens calling into authority. Calling alone is noisy. Authority is quiet. And quiet authority is dangerous. This is why witches fear believers who don't announce what they're doing spiritually. They move silently. They shift things quietly. They don't explain themselves. And suddenly doors open. Opposition fades. Resistance weakens. Now let me correct another misunderstanding. Fasting does not make you superior to others, it makes you responsible. Because increased authority comes with increased accountability. This is why fasting believers must be careful with words, attitudes, and reactions. Witches look for misuse of authority, pride, harsh judgment, spiritual arrogance. Those things create cracks. But humility seals power. This is why fasting done in humility is unstoppable. Now listen carefully to this next part. Witches fear fasting believers who stop seeking signs and start recognizing patterns. Because patterns reveal strategies, and once a strategy is exposed, it loses effectiveness. Fasting sharpens pattern recognition. You start noticing cycles, repeated distractions, recurring emotional triggers, and once you see them, you stop reacting blindly. This is when spiritual warfare becomes strategic instead of emotional, and witches lose strategic advantage. Let me be very clear here. The goal of fasting is not to fight witches. The goal of fasting is to remove their relevance. When alignment is complete, attacks don't escalate. They disappear because there's nothing left to attach to. Now I want to address fear directly. Some of you may feel uneasy hearing all this. Let me ground you. Witches fear fasting believers not because believers are aggressive, but because they are aligned with divine order. Darkness cannot override order. It can only exploit disorder. Fasting restores order. That's why it works. Not because of suffering, but because of structure. And structure is unbreakable. Now let me leave you with something deeply practical and powerful. If you choose to fast after this message, do not rush. Prepare your spirit more than your body. Forgive first. Repent honestly. Quiet your environment. Clarify your intention. Commit to obedience. Then fast calmly. Not desperately, not emotionally. Calm fasting scares witches more than dramatic fasting ever could, because calm fasting signals authority, and authority changes everything. You don't need to announce victory. Victory announces itself. Stay with Shadow Warefare, because this channel exists to expose what hides in the dark, not to glorify it, but to dismantle it. And remember this, the enemy does not fear your hunger, they fear your alignment. And alignment is always available. Let's seal this properly, because how a message ends determines how it lives inside the listener. There is a moment every aligned believer reaches where fear simply stops being a motivator. Not because nothing bad can happen, but because fear no longer controls decisions. That moment often comes after fasting, and witches recognize it instantly, because fear is one of their primary tools. Fear makes people rush. Fear makes people over-explain. Fear makes people compromise. But fasting drains fear of its authority. Not instantly, not magically, gradually, legally. This is why fasting believers stop panicking when resistance shows up. They don't interpret resistance as failure. They interpret it as confirmation. Witches hate that mindset, because panic feeds attacks. Calm starves them. Now let me speak to something deeply important. If fasting ever made you feel proud, superior, or spiritually elevated above others, something went wrong. True fasting produces humility, not ego. And humility is not weakness. Humility is stability. Witches cannot manipulate someone who is stable. They can provoke pride. They can inflame insecurity. They can exploit desperation. But humility closes all three doors. This is why the most dangerous fasting believers are often the quietest ones. They don't announce spiritual victories. They don't threaten the enemy verbally. They don't dramatize warfare. They simply walk differently. And that difference disrupts everything. Now let me ground this for you practically. You don't need to fast constantly to be effective. Constant fasting without rest leads to burnout. Burnout leads to emotional vulnerability. Emotional vulnerability leads to manipulation. Witches know this too. They hope believers overdo it, exhaust themselves, and collapse. Wisdom prevents that. Fasting should sharpen life, not replace it. It should bring clarity, not pressure, authority, not strain. This is why fasting done wisely produces longevity, and longevity beats intensity every time. Now hear this clearly. The goal is not to terrify witches. The goal is to live so aligned that witchcraft becomes irrelevant to your life. When alignment is complete, attacks stop not because they are defeated, but because they are pointless. Darkness doesn't waste resources where there is no access. That's the ultimate victory. Not endless battles, but peace through authority. And peace through authority is sustainable. If you're still listening, I want you to understand something about yourself. You are not weak for needing clarity. You are not failing because you've been attacked. You are not behind because resistance followed you. Resistance often follows potential, and fasting refines potential into authority. Authority into stability. Stability into peace. And peace is the enemy of darkness, because darkness thrives on chaos. Now let me leave you with this final truth, not as a threat, not as hype, but as grounding wisdom. You don't win spiritual battles by being aggressive. You win by being aligned. Alignment changes what is allowed to touch you, and fasting is one of the clearest ways to restore that alignment, quietly, legally, effectively. If this message helped you see clearly, stay connected to Shadow Warefare, because here we don't stir fear, we remove confusion. And when confusion is gone, fear has nowhere to stand. Remember this as you move forward. The enemy does not fear your noise. They fear your order. They fear your discipline. They fear your clarity. They fear your alignment. And alignment is always within reach. This is Shadow Warefare. Stay aware. Stay aligned and walk forward without fear.